It seems every young man dreams of owning one.
It took me like 15 years to get one.
The design is classic. It speaks of luxury, speed, performance, perfection.
This is a rolling dream. It's somebody's dream on wheels.
Credo che ogni giovane voglia una Porsche perché è una macchina con cui si rimorchiano un sacco di ragazze.
Two visionary men are behind this seductive vehicle.
Probably Ferdinand and Ferry Porsche have the honor of being the guys to establish the good name of the German engineering excellence in the world.
Ferdinand Porsche and his son Ferry were each innovators in their own right. While the father dreamt of a people's car and collaborated with a dictator to realize his vision,
Hitler felt Porsche could do almost anything.
the son was behind the creation of the classic sports car, coveted to this day.
It's about excellence. It's, in many ways, a reflection of the way we all want to be in our lives.
The father was the commander, was the leading force, and Ferry was the smart young man who executes the orders.
Together, they created one of the most sought-after and recognizable brands on the planet.
You open the door to a Porsche, you get in, you close your eyes, and you instantly know that you're in Porsche.
This expert coachmaker, working only from original drawings and painstaking research, is recreating from scratch the world's first hybrid automobile, which debuted in 1900.
It was called Semper Vivus, and they recreated the car beautifully from the original drawings. The Semper Vivus, always alive.
It was designed by a great engineering innovator. The man behind the vision is Ferdinand Porsche. His impact on the industry lives on today in vehicles like this present-day Porsche hybrid, unveiled 110 years after the original. This single-minded focus on design and excellence has been a hallmark of an unusual family, the Porsches. In the last century, they grew into an automotive dynasty, fueled by the uncompromising drive and vision of the family's patriarch, Ferdinand Porsche.
He was really a genius as an engineer. You always had the impression that whenever he looked at something, he didn't ask himself how it worked, but how it could be done differently, how it could be improved.
Ferdinand Porsche was born in Maffersdorf, a small village in Bohemia, Eastern Europe, now part of the Czech Republic.
It was on September 3rd, 1875, in what was then Austria-Hungary, that 30-year-old Anton and 25-year-old Anna Porsche welcomed the newborn into their strict and industrious household. As a young boy, Ferdinand enjoyed music and athletics, but was aloof to other children and their games. He preferred to tinker at a workbench, trying to figure out how things worked. It was the passion that would shape his life and place him at odds with his father. After the tragic death of his eldest son in an industrial accident, Anton pressured young Ferdinand to follow in his footsteps in the family's tinsmithing business. Ferdinand had other ideas. Maffersdorf's proximity to both Vienna and Prague offered him access to an exciting new technology, electricity.
Electricity was quite like atomic power today, very futuristic.
With characteristic single-mindedness, Ferdinand ignored his father's demands and began to experiment with batteries in the family workshop.
His father was irate. He said, I don't want to see any of that, get rid of that. Porsche did. He took it up to the attic. And when his father found out about it, he went up to the attic and trashed it, jumped up and down, wrecked everything.
But Ferdinand would not be deterred.
He had a strong will, and when he made up his mind, he said to himself that somehow it was going to be done.
15-year-old Ferdinand finally won the battle of wills with his father, who allowed him to begin attending evening classes at a nearby technical school. Immersed in the study of electricity, Ferdinand prepared a stunning surprise for his parents.
Ferdinand electrified the house, which was really an innovative thing at the time, and then was called on by the neighbors to do similar projects.
So at the end, the father was quite proud of this achievement because it was the first shop in Maffersdorf with electric lamps and lighting.
At 18, Ferdinand moved to Vienna to attend the technical university there and to work for an electrical manufacturing firm. Restless, Ferdinand soon found himself drawn to automotive technology, still in its infancy at the turn of the century. The young prodigy was hired as a designer by Jacob Lohner, a prominent Viennese carriage maker, whose electrically driven carriages were extremely underpowered. Ferdinand's radically unconventional design for the Lohner Porsche relied on two small electric engines on the front wheels instead of a heavy, centralized engine. By propelling the wheels directly, he eliminated inefficient differentials that sapped power.
The car developed in cooperation with Lohner was exhibited in Paris in 1900 as the Lohner Porsche. So at the age of 25, young Ferdinand Porsche was on the world stage.
Ferdinand's next remarkable innovation was to develop a gas and electric car.
In fact, Ferdinand Porsche invented the hybrid system. He devised a system where he had a petrol engine running a generator with some batteries, and the batteries were feeding the electric motors in each wheel of the car.
This mixed wagon, the first hybrid car, was an early four-wheel drive vehicle. Ferdinand drove it to Versailles at the then scorching speed of 9 miles per hour. He was way ahead of his time.
Still a train, electric diesel train, used this system until now.
For grandfather, it was important to work on things others considered difficult, possibly unsolvable. My grandfather liked to show that it was possible.
While in Vienna, Ferdinand met a bookkeeper, Aloysia Johanna Kays. An independent woman, Aloysia was charmed by Ferdinand's passion for automobiles and drove with him in a mixed wagon to Maffersdorf to meet his parents. Although his father, Anton, complained that Aloysia was too skinny, Ferdinand's strong will once again won out. The young couple married on October 17, 1903. True to workaholic form, Ferdinand barely made it to the wedding after getting stuck at a business meeting. But Ferdinand's career was about to hit the first of many speed bumps. Jacob Lohner was growing unhappy with his spendthrift engineer.
Lohner became aware that with all of Porsche's experimentation, not many vehicles were being sold. And so in 1905, chiefly because Porsche had cost more than he'd brought in, he parted the ways with the young engineer. And this, we have to admit, became a kind of leitmotif of Porsche's career.
With a new wife to care for and a young daughter, Louise, who arrived in 1904, 31-year-old Ferdinand Porsche could not afford to be idle for long. In 1906, he landed a dream job as a technical director at one of Austria's largest car companies, Austro-Daimler. By 1908, at 33, Porsche was producing racing vehicles for his new employer that traveled at speeds topping 75 miles per hour. And young Porsche was often behind the wheel himself.
What he learned on the racetrack, he would then put it back into the cars that he was making.
This philosophy improving the breed through racing dates back to the very beginning of Ferdinand Porsche's career and suited his taste for adventure.
Dr. Porsche enjoyed racing cars. He believed that the real world was far more intense than the pressures you could put these automotive designs through in the laboratory.
Professional success was accompanied by personal happiness when in 1909, Aloysia Porsche gave birth to the couple's second child, Ferdinand, who would be given the nickname Ferry. But the boy's father did not witness the birth. That same day, he won a race behind the wheel of one of his gasoline electric cars. But soon, the ambitious engineer would have to put away his racing gloves and turn his talents in another direction. The drumbeats of war would soon sound. As a young man, the danger and speed of the racetrack captured the imagination of Ferdinand Porsche. Today's average Porsche driver also dreams of harnessing the power and precision of the machine at his command.
That same car that on Sunday can go off and win a Porsche Club racing event, Monday morning can carry the kids to school.
At the Macan racetrack on the Adriatic coast of Italy, these Porsche enthusiasts are about to put their skills to the test at the Porsche International Sport Driving School.
Ciao Marcello. Ciao. Piacere Max, tutto bene? Vai, numero 5. Dai all'interno.
One day when a friend of mine was driving a Porsche in Paris, and I was hearing the sound of the engine, you know, roaring, and so it was incredible. So I fell in love with Porsche immediately. And from that point onwards, you know, was my dream. Well, first of all, I want to have fun, that's for sure. And I want to try to improve my skills in driving. So.
Racing has always been the lifeblood of the Porsche. Pushing a car past the limit at the track ensures that the cars they sell maintain their edge on city streets and country roads. But young Ferdinand Porsche was about to give up the thrill of the track.
When the kids were 10 years old, maybe, he quit racing because he had children to feed, and after all, he wanted to be really an engineer. Ferdinand Porsche was really an engineer at heart.
Meanwhile, his young son, called Ferry, was learning at his knee.
Ferry Porsche was very much a child of the automotive age. In fact, he said at one time that I come into the world with the automobile.
Ferry only had to look to his driven father for inspiration. Ferdinand was nearly obsessive about work, but he was not oblivious to the political tensions that were beginning to push Europe toward a world war. He threw himself into designing more than just fast cars.
With Austro-Daimler, he also developed several aircraft engines. He felt that he could see signs of a conflict coming and wanted the company to be ready. And at a time when Austria had no airplanes, he developed an airplane engine.
Porsche's work was timely. With the assassination of Franz Joseph in 1914, Austria and the entire world plunged into World War. Porsche's most innovative wartime contribution was a land train, with a tractor pulling 6 trailers, known as the Sea Train. It could carry boats, soldiers, and a Skoda cannon weighing 26 tons over open terrain or on train tracks. These behemoths gave the Austrian army unparalleled mobility over difficult terrain. As a result of his wartime efforts, Porsche was awarded military honors and an honorary doctorate. Ferdinand, appointed chairman at Austro-Daimler, was now known as Herr Professor Dr. Porsche. While the war provided rewards for the 43-year-old designer, it was unkind to his dual homelands of Austria and Germany. They were devastated at war's end in 1918. In this fragile economic climate, Ferdinand came up with an idea that would dominate the rest of his life: smaller, more affordable cars.
He knew that the future was not for larger, heavier cars. He was thinking of something smaller, not so expensive, maybe cheaper to produce.
But his bosses balked at this proposal. Instead, Ferdinand developed small sports cars named Sachas after a film producer and racing friend of his, Count Sascha Collerat, who financed the effort.
And that was his new philosophy, to go away from these big, heavy cars. And it was only a 4-cylinder, but with 8 spark plugs.
The additional spark plugs gave the cars greater efficiency and reliability. 3 Sachas were sent to the Targa Florio race of 1922. The course was a demanding 268 miles over potholed, hilly roads. The gutsy Sachas won with their smaller car class against powerful French and Italian competition.
I think that he saw a future where the car could be a little bit more democratic. A light car is a car that may go faster, is better, consumes less fuel, will be easier to maintain, so a lighter car could be a better car.
The problem with the small car, however, is that a small car, small price, and unless you tool up to make them in substantial volume, you're going to lose money on them.
Austro-Daimler's directors were looking for an excuse to close down Porsche's unprofitable racing division. They got their excuse in the autumn of 1922. At the last race of the year, driver Fritz Kuhne's car flipped, killing him.
They looked upon that as a good reason to shut down the competition department. This upset Ferdinand because of his belief that racing actually improved the breed.
Porsche angrily resigned and took a position in Stuttgart with the German version of Daimler, which had fallen on hard times following the war.
In every car manufacturer where he worked, he always had this kind of clash. He really thought that his ideas were the only ideas to follow. His family had to follow him. Everybody who worked with him had to conform to his ideas. I think he was quite a difficult man to work with.
Porsche was brought in to restore the company's name through racing, but his blunt, hands-on manner did not fit in well with the staid corporate climate at Daimler. Despite the clash of styles, Porsche developed several successful lines of 6-cylinder cars: the Mercedes S, SS, SSK, and SSKL. His modifications to the German Mercedes enabled Daimler-Benz to claim victory at the Targa Florio race in Sicily in 1924. But once again, Porsche's mind returned to his passion, designing smaller, affordable cars.
Daimler-Benz, I think, rightly said, wait a second, this is not our area of activity. This doesn't make sense for us. We're not going to go in this direction.
When Porsche's contract expired in 1928, Daimler declined to renew it. Ferdinand's brusque style had alienated his bosses to such a degree that Mercedes employees and their wives were threatened with dismissal if they had any contact with Porsche.
Ferdinand Porsche, he was such a genius, and maybe that was a problem, that he was always go forward. Every day he want from the partners, and he want everything to realize. And those ideas to realize, of course, costs.
Ferdinand was so prolific that most of his designs languished in drawers, dreams that would never become reality.
I think that Ferdinand Porsche ran out of companies for whom he could work, because he had already had arguments with Daimler or Benz or all the major concerns around the area of Stuttgart.
By 1931, 56-year-old Porsche had spent 3 decades working for some of the most revered names in Europe's automotive industry. Yet his dissatisfaction had grown with the passing years. Now it was time to go out on his own.
Genius has always problems with with people and with bosses, and that was the reason that he opened or started a new company, 31, in Stuttgart.
Ferdinand Porsche at the beginning didn't have much money, so he found some financing with his brother-in-law, who had married his sister Louise. At the beginning, it was not a large operation. There were only a handful of guys.
9 Austrian designers formed the core of this new company, Ferdinand Porsche's design office for engine and motor vehicle construction in Stuttgart, Germany. Among those designers was his son, Ferry, who had grown up watching his father forge a vision of what an automobile should be. Now that his father was on his own, 22-year-old Ferry, an engineer with a subdued, business-like style, would quickly become an asset to the company.
Of course, the son, Ferdinand Anton, he was the first employee of Porsche Studio.
My father reached his goal with sensitivity and understanding. My grandfather could be hot-tempered. One time he threw down his hat and danced on it out of anger.
Ferdinand's intensity made running his own business a struggle from the start.
Ferdinand Porsche was a man, I think, that was caught up in his own thoughts pretty much. He was a guy that had his experiments, his engineering projects, his design work in the forefront of his mind, and that's really what drove him through life.
At the outset, business conditions in Germany were far from favorable.
In 1929, when the stock market crashed, the short period of prosperity of the Weimar Republic came to an end.
Despite these trying times and Porsche's intensely demanding nature, a family atmosphere pervaded the company. Ferdinand's staff was always welcome in his home.
It was the relationship to his workers that was remarkable. His engineers and technicians. They lay on the floor, relaxed and conversed. For him, the world in which he lived was both private and commercial. It was one.
Die gelebt hat, privat und geschäftlich. Das war eines.
Father and son often brought work home from the office to the dinner table.
Nothing else was talked about. Even grandmother said, "Could you stop it now? Let us eat. You can discuss that later." It was always about the same subject matter.
The Porsche Design Company's first contract was for a mid-size car, ordered by the Wanderer firm. Shrewdly, Porsche chose to label the project number 7 rather than number 1.
There were no projects 1 through 6 because in his thinking he decided, hey, if we go out into the marketplace and say we're looking for business and this is design project number 1, people are going to think we're just beginners, we have no experience.
Other works soon followed. The Zundat Works, a motorcycle company, commissioned designs for a small car. It was the chance Porsche was waiting for, to return to the question of how to make a car for the average German. All of these precursors to what would become the Volkswagen proved too expensive to make and never made it past the prototype stage.
There was no such thing that he would say, "It is impossible." Of course, it was also scary for the clients. They didn't know what it would cost.
Ferdinand Porsche's company soon found a customer with deep pockets who would not balk at the cost of building a people's car. Chancellor Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been elected in 1933, largely on the basis of his promise of bread, work, and honor to a nation crippled by unemployment and humiliated by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that had ended World War I.
Hitler wanted for Germany a position of supremacy in every sector, in every field. And one of the sectors that were the future in those years, in the 30s, was the automobile.
But Hitler's desire to build a people's car was also part of his strategy in preparing his country for war. In Adolf Hitler, Ferdinand Porsche would find a partner with whom to realize his dream. but the alliance would cost him dearly. Adolf Hitler knew that in Ferdinand Porsche, he had found a perfectionist who could execute his vision for a people's car. That attention to workmanship lives on today. So many specialists are involved in a Porsche's construction that these elite cars are practically handmade.
The pride of having someone with a white glove rubbing down the body of a Porsche 911 to feel microscopic variations in the finish is something you would only find from the finest coach builders.
At the Porsche Sport Driving School in Misano, Italy, student Marcello is discovering the capabilities of the car he covets.
The limits of this car are really incredible, you know. On the curves, acceleration, braking, it's really a top car, unbelievable. What people don't know is that when you drive a Porsche in the street, it's able to drive on the track like that.
The Porsche company still exhibits the perfectionism of the man who inspired its first car, Ferdinand Porsche. But in the 1930s, his passion for excellence was being harnessed by a dictator to create a so-called people's car.
Part of the overall plan for this people's car was to create an Autobahn system, a freeway system for the populace to move around the country. Also in the back of Hitler's mind was the use of this for military purposes for rapid troop movement.
In September 1933, Porsche was summoned to a meeting with Adolf Hitler at a hotel in Berlin. Hitler held forth on his ideas for a car for the German working man.
Hitler was kind of an automotive enthusiast himself, and he also understood the technical side of automobiles. So in Ferdinand Porsche's mind, I'm sure he saw this guy as an ally.
Hitler outlined his design ideas for Porsche. Among them, four-wheel drive and an air-cooled engine. None of this was surprising to the veteran engineer until Hitler revealed the target selling price, 900 marks, the equivalent of $360, an impossibly low figure.
When Opel and the other manufacturers said that it was impossible to build a proper car to be sold under 1,000 Reichsmarks, Ferdinand Porsche said, "I can do it."
Although wary of this unrealistic selling price, Ferdinand was willing to do business with a man who had exploited hatred and violence in his rise to power.
Well, Ferdinand Porsche surely enjoyed the partnership with the Nazi Party. Hitler had a lot of esteem for him.
The People's Car, also known as the Volkswagen, was in many ways the brainchild of both men. Porsche's design company had no workshop, so the Volkswagen prototypes were assembled in the Porsche family garage in Stuttgart, under the supervision of Ferdinand's son, Ferry. Father and son collaborated closely.
Ferry was running the test drives and organized it through the Black Forest and the long-distance tests. And Ferdinand was always behind and checked the results.
Ferdinand realized that it would take mass production to reduce the Volkswagen's price to anything close to Hitler's target. In 1937, he and Ferry visited Henry Ford's factory in Detroit. An admirer of Hitler and Nazi sympathizer, Ford opened up his factory to the Porsches and freely answered their questions.
They brought back German Americans who had worked in the U.S. industry with Ford and others, and they brought a lot of the mass production know-how that is embodied in the original Volkswagen.
Buoyed by the lessons he learned in America, Porsche oversaw the construction of a VW plant in Wolfsburg, in Germany's heartland. The plant successfully assembled a few hundred Beetles. But when war broke out in 1939, it was immediately converted to the manufacture of weapons. Ferdinand may have been unaware of many of Hitler's plans, but he actively used his relationship with the dictator to secure lucrative weapons contracts.
Porsche was quite a bit older than the Nazi regime of the 1930s. Ferry reflected later, he said, really the relationship between my father and Hitler was as if my father was Hitler's father. There were probably only half a dozen people in the Third Reich who dared to say to Hitler what they really thought, and my father was one of them.
He never said, Heil Hitler. All he said was, good day, Herr Hitler. He felt he was above it, but he probably didn't care either way. I cannot believe that anyone else could afford to do that.
I think that Hitler respected a lot this guy, this very hard man that talked very little and always said something appropriate at the right moment.
Under Ferdinand and Ferry's supervision, the Wolfsburg factory produced a variety of war supplies. At Ferry's instigation, Volkswagen designs were modified to produce a German Jeep, the Kübelwagen, which also came in an amphibious model, the Schwimmwagen.
General Rommel went out of his way to compliment Porsche on the very good performance of the Kübelwagen. It easily ran over the sand in the deserts of North Africa. Very reliable and good vehicle for the army.
So he was proud of this. He was proud of doing something for Germany, and Germany, of course, in that moment was Nazi Germany.
Ja, auf den Reißbrettern war hauptsächlich der Kübelwagen.
The Kübelwagen and the Schwimmwagen. Various tank projects were in development. The Allies also knew about them. That is why it was far too dangerous for them to remain in Stuttgart.
Deshalb war das zu gefährlich, dass die weiter in Stuttgart bleiben.
By 1944, the Allies, who knew of Porsche's military ventures, began inflicting regular bombing attacks against the factory. But even the bombing raids fascinated the engineer in Porsche.
When there was an air raid, he would go with a binocular at night to the garden and observe the planes. He wanted to experience it, be part of it all.
Fleeing the bombing, the Porsche design offices relocated to an old sawmill in the remote town of Gmünd in the Austrian Alps. With the defeat of Germany, the Porsche team made a U-turn. They worked with the Allied occupiers, repairing Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens. The Volkswagen project seemed doomed in a country that could no longer feed itself. But just when it appeared things could not get worse, Ferdinand was arrested by French authorities.
The accusation was that Ferdinand Porsche had managed some factories where there was slave labor. And I think that it was possible that it was true because many German factories, especially after '43, employed a lot of slave labor. This is a sad reality. We cannot deny it.
Although at the least, POWs have been used in Porsche-run factories, the French were said to be more interested in coercing Ferdinand into designing a people's car for them. Now Ferry desperately looked for a way to get his father out of prison. While scrambling to find a way to get his father, Ferdinand, released from a primitive dungeon in Dijon, France, Ferry Porsche immersed himself in a new project that would lead to the driving experience enjoyed by modern-day Porsche loyalists. Today's Porsche is all about precision and control. Form is driven by function. Horsepower takes a backseat to handling, as the students in Misano are finding out.
Il corso Precision è un esercizio per imparare a controllare la potenza di queste vetture e per esempio la frenata con evitamento ostacolo che permette di imparare l'utilizzo dei freni in maniera adeguata.
That's fun. It's a lot of fun.
But in post-war Germany, fun was the furthest thing from Ferry Porsche's mind. Now 70 years old, his father Ferdinand had been held for 20 months in poor conditions. his health was beginning to fail. Ironically, while Ferdinand was in prison, Volkswagens once again began rolling off the production line in the devastated Wolfsburg factory under the supervision of the British occupation forces.
The Allies realized that they needed to provide jobs for people. There weren't enough agricultural jobs around for people to work on the land.
Ferry and his sister Louise secured their father's release with the payment of 1 million francs to French authorities. Now almost 72 and in failing health, Ferdinand was freed on August 1st, 1947. Ferry had a surprise for his father.
He had already begun a project for a small sports car based on the Volkswagen.
The son had finally stepped out from his father's shadow. His Porsche 356, originally a two-seater, borrowed the utilitarian frame and modified engine of a Volkswagen. But the sportier, streamlined body reflected Ferry's more refined vision of what an automobile could be. Ferdinand was justifiably proud of his son's work, but he had one suggestion about the location of the engine, which Ferry had moved to the center of the vehicle. He asked his son to return it to the rear position.
This was the real stroke of genius, and Ferry Porsche was so smart as to say, yes, father, you are right, let's put the engine back. So they developed a car that was quick, fast, sporty, but still had 4 seaters. And this is still the secret of the success of the 911, of the 356, of many other sporting Porsche, that you have a very sporting car, high performance, nice to drive and so on, but with 4 seats.
Ferdinand, in declining health, would use his remaining strength to lend credibility to Ferry's fledgling car company. The name Porsche has become synonymous with performance, speed, style. But the heart and most of the guts of the first Porsche were assembled from Volkswagen parts. Ferry Porsche had taken his father's car, the Beetle, and transformed it into the first car that would bear the simple Porsche logo. At war's end, Ferry had several prototype Porsches completed, but this was hardly an auspicious time to introduce a sports car to the public.
In 1945, things were worse than in 1918 because Germany had been bombed, the war had been carried to German soil.
An astute businessman, Ferry negotiated royalties for his father's design work on the fast-selling Beetle and launched his new sports car company, putting the Porsche 356 into production. Ferry sold cars through the network of VW dealerships, but he was unsure of the car's appeal and only produced 400 of them in 1950. From the outset, demand outstripped production. There was great interest in this car with such an uncommon combination of practicality and speed. But the car was also popular because of its distinctive aerodynamic silhouette, which was devoid of extraneous ornaments or grills.
It was extremely slippery, extremely efficient. And this was another one of the many stroke of geniuses of the project of the 356.
Production expanded to keep pace with demand. The company would sell 50,000 cars by 1962. Like his father, Ferry turned to racing as a proven way to test the cars and a flashy way to publicize the company. But Ferdinand's health had been ruined by his incarceration. He suffered a stroke in November 1950 and died on January 30th, 1951. His body was buried in the tiny chapel on his estate in Zellum-See, Austria.
Even though at the end he was very sickly and very dispirited from being in prison for so long, I think ultimately he died a happy man because of the fact seeing his life dream and is carried out by his son.
Ferdinand Porsche was the engineer's engineer, and his spirit lives on in his functional yet elegant designs. Now his son Ferry would carve out his own place in history as the consummate businessman building the company that made the family name famous.
When Ferry built the first car in Austria, the weekend after they finished it, they raced it.
They entered a car in the 1951 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the car won its class. And that's how the company got its reputation not only for racing, but also for being kind of a giant killer.
I think that without the races, Porsche would not be so famous and probably would not have developed all the technical excellence that they enjoy today.
With the death of his father in 1951, Ferry Porsche took over as patriarch of both the business and the family. He was ready to take his new company to the next level. Ferry Porsche was determined to take his father's legacy into the future. That legacy is still going strong here in the 21st century.
Bene a destra, destra, ok.
The most important lesson is that you get the feeling of the car, the same car you're driving in the streets. You know how fast it goes, what's the braking limit, and you feel really confident with the car.
What makes a Porsche a certain face, a style that you can immediately recognize as a Porsche, a kind of sound, the engineering quality that you feel in every part of the car that you touch, that you handle, the way it drives.
It all started with the uncompromising family patriarch, Ferdinand Porsche. He had put cars within reach of the masses, embodied by a vehicle with the lowly name Beetle. But after his death, his son Ferry Porsche built on this legacy by harnessing a unique combination of power and elegance that still inspires desire in today's car buyer.
Ferry Porsche developed the company with a very strong hand and I must say with very serious principles, very German.
Ferry was at the races. He was there with the stopwatch. He was there with his sons.
Ferry had 4 boys. The oldest, Ferdinand Alexander, nicknamed Bootsy, would take the most active role in the company. Starting in the early 1960s, Bootsy began working on the styling of the new Porsche line. By 1963, the 28-year-old would be named chief of the new styling department. This was a pivotal time at Porsche. Ferry knew that the company was being driven into a dead end by its reliance on the 356, a car whose design fundamentals went all the way back to the Volkswagen of the 1930s.
They came out with this killer initial product, and what do they do for an encore? So they had to come up with something that still said Porsche to the world, but still was a step or two ahead in terms of design and engineering.
The responsibility for designing the successor to the 356 fell squarely on Ferry's eldest son. Bootsy focused on designing a car that was new and old at the same time.
Past knowledge is the soil on which the future can grow, and depending on how one nurtures this soil, the future grows.
Some of the things that Bootsy looked at in terms of designing the 911 was the fact that in styling it still had to look like a Porsche. He said up front it had to have this Porsche face, which was the 356 look. So he kind of set forth a sleeker version of that for his 911 project.
Design is classic. They did their homework right. They designed a car that was beautiful to look at and was totally efficient.
Porsche unveiled the powerful and stylish 911 at the Frankfurt Auto Show in 1963. With an additional 2 cylinders adding 35 horsepower, the 911 was capable of cruising past the 356 at 130 miles per hour. Almost immediately, it established itself as the standard of sports car design.
There's been some bulges here and some resculpturing there, but basically the sculpture and the silhouette of the car has remained pretty constant. That's one of the real unique personalities of a Porsche, is that that shape is so recognizable.
The 911 recharged the public's interest in Porsche. By 1966, 100,000 Porsches had been sold. Seeking a successor, Ferry saw Buzzi's 911 Triumph as his key to inherit the stewardship of the company. But Buzzi had a strong rival, his cousin, Ferdinand Piëch, who was active in the engineering department at Porsche. It was this cousin who was a driving force behind the company's winning several world championships.
Around 1971, just when the sports racing department was going so well and was winning everything, there were huge frictions between the two parts of the family.
By 1972, it rose to a head, and Ferry Porsche said, well, if neither of you are able to run the company, then we'll let someone else do it completely. Ferry Porsche was a hard manager, there's no question of that. He made some very difficult decisions.
In 1972, Ferry decided to bring in a series of managers to lead the company into the 21st century. This strategy turned the focus away from family squabbles to making Porsche leaner, more efficient, and more profitable. Ferry's calm presence was an inspiration until the end of his life.
One of the designers at Porsche said to me when Ferry came into the studio to look at something, it was a big event, and a handshake would keep me going for another 6 months.
Ferry Porsche, by '98, must have been a very happy man. He knew that the legacy that his father and he had built was in good hands.
He pioneered the idea of everyday high-performance sports car, of a car that could be at the same time very fast, luxurious, reliable, comfortable.
At 88, Ferry Porsche died peacefully of natural causes at the family home in Zellamsee.
For everybody it was a shock, because he was, maybe he was a father of this company.
Ferry's death ended an era at Porsche. In the ensuing years, Porsche continued to thrive both on the track and off.
Started by one man's imagination and his ingenuity and his drive, but I think it was carried out not only by him, but by his entire family.
The legacy of the Porsche family was forged by the pure engineering of Ferdinand Porsche and popularized car by his son, Ferry. This legacy lives on behind the wheels of the cars that embody their vision. In 2012, Porsche will introduce the 7th generation of its iconic 911 model. The company continues to advance in hybrid technology on the racetrack and off. The Cayenne, the Panamera, the Cayman, and the Boxster models continue to thrill auto enthusiasts. And under the leadership of Porsche CEO Matthias Müller, a long-awaited merger with Volkswagen is in the works.
When you drive a car like this, when you go home, you start going like the way around because you have fun.
High performance and loyalty, inspired by Ferdinand and Ferry Porsche, are what is carrying the company into the future.
You can sell your Porsche, you can stay a bit without your Porsche, but sooner or later you feel absolutely in need of purchasing another one.